did Buddhism succumb to a Brahminical quote unquote jihad? As there is a lot of allegations being passed around on social media and Twitter nowadays that Hindu rulers destroyed Buddhist monasteries and etc. etc. So the secularist alliance has been defeated in its attempt to deny the millennial Islamic campaign of jihad to destroy Hinduism, which remains vividly illustrated by the ruins of numerous Hindu temples and proven by numerous testimonies in Islamic chronicles. So now they focus on accusing the Hindus of the same behavior slash jihad against Buddhism instead. Now, how to pin pick this attack? We have our speaker, Dr. Conrad Elst, to kind of give a context and a perspective on that. Welcome, Dr. Elst. So, Dr. Elst, my first question to you on this topic is, was the Buddha himself persecuted by the Hindus? Was he murdered by the Hindus?
Well, yeah, that's a good question to ask because for some religion founders, that is indeed what happens. About Jesus, you must have heard how he ended. Then Muhammad was poisoned by the widow of one of his victims. Zarathustra probably was also murdered, though it is not clear if he was murdered because they wanted him rather than if he was murdered just because soldiers were killing everyone they could find. Then the founder of the Baha'i sect spent years in prison, and so on. I mean, there are a number of people who have had a sorry end. Now, that did not happen to the Buddha. There is absolutely no case of persecution of the Buddha. There were a few attempts on his life, but they were by a jealous pupil in his own order. So it's not an ideological attempted murder at all. So no, you see, he died in high age 80, in his bed, so to speak. I mean, even though he didn't use the comfort of a bed, but it was by food poisoning. At age 80, you don't have to do much wrong to die from it. But so it was not an attempt on his life or anything of the sort, not even by one of his own disciples. So it was just a peaceful affair. There was some violence in his life, though. These incidents I mentioned, they happened totally at the end of his life, when he was like 77, 79. Namely, his own sort of complicity in a military operation by the Magadha kingdom, but he was very distantly involved. And he gave some advice to one of the plotters, though you can't say that he advised them to do this invasion, to do this conquest, not at all. Then there's something else, which is the Shakya Hatya, the killing of his own tribe. So you could say that that's an enormous failure. That's not, what you would expect from some towering figure like the Buddha. But so he tried to prevent, but didn't succeed in preventing the massacre of the tribe that he came from, the Shakyas. But that, again, you see, had nothing to do with any ideological matter. They also weren't per se Buddhists. So that had to do with a family feud, and so these are the things that happen in this veil of tears, according to the Buddha himself. So it's a pity, but it cannot at all help the case for Buddhist persecution.
Thank you, Dr. Elst. Now my next question is, where does Pushyamitra account come from? And the Divya Vadana claims he promised rewards for bringing in the severed heads of the Buddhist monks.
Right. Now, first of all, this text is about 300 years after the events, so it's not exactly an eyewitness account. Many ideological and other considerations may have come in. But moreover, in the same text, you find an account about Ashoka, where he offers a reward for heads of people from a rival sect. They're called Nilgranthas, probably Jainas are meant. So Ashoka, of course, was not such a peaceful character. You know, even though you may associate Buddhism with non-violence, he was not exactly non-violent. He and all this happened while he was a Buddhist. You see, there's some misunderstanding about this. Some people say that later in life, after everything terrible he did was over, then he introspected and he became a Buddhist. That's not at all the case. He was already a Buddhist when his father was still ruling, and he was the governor of some part of central India. And so when his father died, he grabbed power, eliminating his older brother, who was the legitimate heir to the throne, and then killing many of his other brothers. There was a brother still left alive who is going to play a role here. So after quite a bit of bloodletting, he came to power. Then he also tried to achieve natural borders by conquering this recalcitrant part of India called Kalinga. And then he wanted to do something about the Nilgranthas. And so he issued an award according to this same Buddhist source. You see, again, of course, centuries later. Nevertheless, it's not Buddhists who are going to accuse Buddhists of anything normally. So here you see about their own champion Ashoka, they say that he awarded some gold for whoever brought him the severed head of an Nilgrantha. Then people apparently took it serious because some heads were coming in. And then one of the heads that was brought to him was the head of his brother, the brother he had left alive. And so then he realized, what am I doing? And so then he stopped. Moreover, and so the story about Pushyamitra is rather obviously a calque, an imitation on this story about Ashoka. Moreover, it's not a very serious story because it has some miracle elements in it. So some very saintly Buddhist managed to produce out of thin air something that looked like a head, a balloon. And so if you wanted to collect the reward, you could get one of those balloons and bring that in and pass it off as a head of a Buddhist. So that story is really not to be taken serious. Moreover, it is at variance with the known fact that the patronage of Buddhism, the building of Buddhist institutions and so on simply went on, continued during Shunga rule. So there is really no indication. And serious scholars like my countryman Etienne Lamotte have said that, you see, there is, due to lack of evidence, Pushyamitra must be acquitted. So that story is a story.
Now, Dr. Els, the third question is that the Hunas are claimed to have destroyed Buddhist temples.
Mm-hmm.
Did they?
Yeah, well, the Hunas did work some destruction in India. They started out, you see, upon entering India, almost the first thing they encountered was the Vedic University of Takshashila, which they destroyed. So it is quite possible that they did some destruction, and I mean this Takshashila case is certified that they really did. So yeah, this is quite possible, though you have to see that the source is again not that reliable. You have the Chinese travelers who give a lot of hearsay. You see, they report that some Hindu king did something to Buddhists, but it's all hearsay, and it may also be generations old what they report and so on. So that's in this category. So it may happen. You see, it's not a Brahminical onslaught. This is by the Hunas, but okay, it's not impossible. That's all we can say as responsible historians. You see, we have these accounts. There may be something true of these accounts, but then you do have cases of violence between sects, even between Hindu sects. Like the famous example they always give is at some Kumbh Mela, there was a violent confrontation between Shaiva monks and Vaishnava monks for the honor of being the first to take a ritual bath. So such things may have happened once in a while in Indian history. So we have very little hard evidence for any of that. But in principle, it could have happened. Yes. You have to look closely because often it's not what it is now made out to be. So now they're starting to say, okay, anything that the Muslims have done to Hindus, that the Hindus have also done to Buddhists. That's absolutely not true. And where this seems to be true, you still have to look close because there is often an angle to it that casts a different light on it. Like you have this case of Harsha of Kashmir, where it is said explicitly that he tried to plunder temples, not specifically Buddhist temples, but also Buddhist temples. And so there, in the Raja Tarangini, it is said that, inspired by the Turks in his employ, he behaved like a Turk. So, even there, it is explicitly recognized that even if a Hindu did it, it's a Muslim phenomenon. It's the Muslims who have brought this bad habit into India.
Now, Dr. asked, who destroyed Buddhism outside India?
Yeah, well, before looking at what happened to Buddhism in India, it's of course instructive what happened to Buddhism first in Central Asia. And so there, Buddhism was quite effectively destroyed. That counts for instance, Tung Kwang, where the Tokharians left a lot of legacy in terms of Buddhist scriptures, Buddhist translations, also some original Buddhist writings. So that Tokharian population has been absorbed into what are now the Uyghurs, who are Muslims. But far to the west in Uzbekistan, you also have plenty of Buddhism. Buddhism was clearly the most conspicuous religion at the time, like Tashkent is from Takshakhanda. And so you do see, in fact, a little bit of remnant of this Buddhism within Islam, namely in Sufism. You see, when you look at the theology in Sufism, you find notions like the fana, which means the annihilation. And so that's the goal of meditation. And that is like a calque on the Buddhist notion of nirvana, of this blowing out, this emptiness, this shunya. So there was a period of transition where enough of Buddhism was still alive to influence some interested Islamic thinkers. But at any rate, the result is that within a few generations, Buddhism had disappeared completely. So you must have heard about the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is more or less the cradle of not of Buddhism itself, but of expansive Buddhism, of global Buddhism. Because it's from there also that Buddhist monks went to China and that Buddhism became big in China and Japan. It's also there that probably the Buddha statue originates. And I know that this is a contentious point. I know that there are Indians who maintain that that this owed nothing to outsiders, at least on the face of it. And I'm not an art historian, but on the face of it, it looks credible. This is a Greek invention, because the Greeks had their Indo-Greek kingdoms in Afghanistan, and so it is rather clear that it is outsiders, that is foreigners who took mostly to this Buddhism. This is counts for the Greeks, for the Tocharians or Kushanas, some of the Scythians, and so the Buddha statue looks like a Greek statue. Like often the Buddha is depicted with curly hair, which is not Indian. It's a typical Mediterranean characteristic. So it's like the Apollo statue. It's a counterpart to the Apollo statue, the Buddha statue. And so you have the Bamiyan Buddhas there, and so there you starts the habit of giant Buddha statues, like you find many in China and Japan. So the Bamiyan Buddhas were already thought to be destroyed in the Middle Ages, but they were so big and the technology wasn't up there yet. So finally in 2001, the Taliban had finally fulfilled this ancient wish of the Islamic invaders. But so in Central Asia, of course, the Brahmins weren't there to destroy Buddhism, so somebody else's jihad was needed.
Thank you, Dr. S. Now, my next question is who destroyed the Nalanda University?
Yeah, this has recently become contentious again. A few years ago, it is D.N. Jha who wrote that this is done by fanatical Hindus, and who denied explicitly that this was done by Bakhtiyar Khilji. You see, Bakhtiyar Khilji was one of the lieutenants of Muhammad Ghori. Muhammad Ghori conquered Delhi in 1192, and then he sent on his troops Shah Suran Ghori, his nephew, and Bakhtiyar Khilji, and a few more into the Ganga Valley. So they conquered it up to Assam, and they destroyed everything in their way. This was the biggest orgy of iconoclasm ever in history. So all the temples in Varanasi were destroyed. Well, this is a point on which I disagree with Meenakshi Jain. I say that the Rama temple was destroyed then, the big Rama temple of which the foundations have been found by archaeologists underneath the Babri Masjid. Okay, so that temple was destroyed already in 1192. Later Hindus may have reconquered it and done something with it, but the big temple that had been destroyed at the end of the 12th century. And so they also destroyed the Buddhist institutions in Bihar, their historical center, including Nalanda University. And the source that D.N. Jha bases himself on is by a Tibetan who wrote a century or so later. And so he doesn't say fanatical Hindus, but he describes it as happening in India. looking at it from Tibet, um, these Muslim interlopers are a part of the Indian landscape. Of course, they were not native there. They came from somewhere in the West. How far in the West? Western India or beyond India, that's all not known to him. So in a way, you see that expression of fanatical Indians at that time, Hindu and Indian, were pretty much synonymous, except for Muslim Indians. So you see that it doesn't exclude at all what we know from better sources as being the doing of Bakhtiyar Khilji, which is, for instance, testified by the Muslim chronicler Minhaj al-Siraj. So it is quite certain that it was Bakhtiyar Khilji. And so it's not the doing of Hindus at all. On the contrary, you see, from the time of the Buddha onwards until 1194 or so, that these institutions have existed. Nalanda was founded somewhere beginning of the Christian era, but other institutions already existed, and so they all continue to exist until the end of the 12th century. So what Jha is saying, in fact, amounts to this. You see, all these Hindu kings, they were just sitting in waiting, lying in waiting, watching these Buddhist institutions, just holding their fire for 1700 years, from the time of the Buddha till the end of the 12th century. And for 17 centuries, they were just letting it all happen. They were letting the Buddhists, going about their business. And then suddenly, in the sight of the Islamic invasion that was coming, they quickly set all these Buddhist institutions on fire so that the Islamic invaders couldn't do it anymore. They couldn't set them into fire because they had already burned down. That's in fact what T.M. Jha says. This is, how ridiculous can you get? That's the length to which they go in order to deny the Islamic guilt in this regard, or to somehow make the Hindus equally guilty. So now you see, you can rest assured that if you start Nalanda again, it's not Hindus who are going to destroy it.
Thank you, Dr. Elst. Next question is, what happened to the Mahabodhi temple?
Yes. Well, I think that contention is still not resolved. There is a governing board consisting of both Buddhists and Shaivas. And so some Buddhists, in the prevailing secularist parlance, I would have to say, some fanatical Buddhists want to just bring it back fully into Buddhism. You see, remove the Shaiva presence. Now, what has happened historically? So this temple was built on the site where the Buddha achieved his awakening, which is in the forest. Of course, he went into the forest to meditate far from the madding crowd. And so the consequence was that when the Muslim armies moved all through Bihar, where they burned down Nalanda and so on, they missed this Mahabodhi temple because it was in the middle of the forest. We're not on the roads of the armies. So it remained standing. Unfortunately, because in the institutions no Buddhists were turned out anymore, no monks came out from there anymore, but they had all been leveled to the ground, or if they were quick enough, had fled to outside India. So this Mahabodhi temple was standing empty. And so The Shaiva monks did survive because they were not as centralized in institutions as the Buddhists were. This is especially true for the whole Vedic tradition because it's passed on from father to son. So it's in the privacy of your own home, and that's a bit much if you want to destroy all that. Whereas these institutions are easily recognizable and all the people are concentrated there, so if you level them, well, then it's over. And so that's what happened there. So the Shaiva monks survived. There was already a Shaiva element in this Mahabodhi temple. You see, many Buddhist temples do have a Shiva or a Ganesha inside. This is normally a Hindu temple, that you have a central deity and that you have some more also. Like in Shankaracharya's formula, there is one central deity and four more. So also, they are sometimes used as doorkeepers. That may be a bit of a low status for a divinity, but it also happened, that they had a Shiva outside the temple where the Buddha was worshipped. So anyway, the Shaivas recognized enough of their Shaivism in the temple, and so they ran it as a Shaiva temple. Now, if I would look at this from the viewpoint of a Buddhist, I'd be grateful because otherwise this temple would have just fallen apart. And so they kept it for centuries. Then finally, you see, when the British came and so on, and the king of Burma also meddled in it, and the Mahabodhi Society founded in Sri Lanka got to know of it and so on. Then you see the Buddhists were back. And so a compromise was found between the original purpose of the temple and the historical fact that Shaivas had taken care of the temple. And so, as things go in the world, I think that was an acceptable compromise, that both parties were represented in the governing board. How that should be in the future, well, that should be amicably settled. I mean, there's nothing more original I can say about it. So I think you have to, of course, do justice to the original Buddhist purpose of the place, but you should also leave a place, as long as it is so desired by the people concerned, to the Shaiva element. That is simply a part of the history of the Mahabodhi side. And anyway, if you look deeper into it, you see there is not much fundamental difference between Shaivism and Buddhism. They're really about the same thing. They're, going for absolute consciousness, unqualified consciousness, nirguna, which is emptiness. And so, that ought not to be a problem. So no riot should be created about this by anyone. And indeed, so far, it has been debated in a civilized manner. But so it is there also the Islamic invaders who have eliminated the Buddhists from there. And so it's not at all because of Brahminical jihad. It's not the Shaiva monks who have run the place who had earlier driven out the Buddhists. That's not the story at all.
Thank you, Dr. Elst. Next question is, now apart from the Buddhists, a similar account concerns the Shaiva saint Jnan Sambandar versus the Jains. He had them massacred. Is that
Yes.
a true contention?
Well, you see, Hindus are not very good history writers. You see, I love you, and all the great things that Hindu civilization has done for mankind and so on is wonderful, but for history writing, they're just not very good. compare, for instance, with the nearby Chinese civilization. From about 800 BC, for every major event in Chinese history, you know the exact date and place. And with date, I don't just mean the year, I mean the actual day. You see, whereas in India, you have these controversies. Was Shankaracharya from the 8th century or from the minus 5th century or so? It's not that level of exactitude. And so it's also here in history writing about Jnana Sambandhar. There is a mix-up of hagiographical elements and real history. And often the miraculous stories have a historical core, but they also have much else. And it's often difficult to make out what is real history. Now, in this case, again, we have some later accounts that goes like this. Jnana Sambandhar, a Shaiva saint, and the local giants in Tamil Nadu had agreed to have a debate. And the stakes of the debate were that the loser would convert to the sect of the winner. And this was a very official debate. This was patronized by the local king. And so he laid down, okay, I will see to it that this agreement is followed up and that the loser converts to the sect of the winner. And when Jnana Sambandhar won the debate, the giants didn't keep their part of the deal. And so they didn't convert. And then the king, not Jnana Sambandhar, but the king then intervened and said, okay, you see, I will not have you trespass against the law that I have laid down. And so then he moved to punish them. If true at all, because that also is not certain. You see, in this type of debate, people throw the word evidence around a lot. Now, you see, in the case of historical evidence, the fact that you have a text that says something doesn't absolutely prove that it also happened. And so in India, especially in this religious literature, you have to be careful. There is a lot of history. There is also a lot of, embellishment and sometimes pure invention also. But so I would certainly not hold Jnana Sambandhar guilty of any persecution of giants or so. And again, you see, this is long after there were Shaiva kings in South India, and yet there were these giants, so they had survived all these centuries already. So clearly, the Shaivas were not, systematically persecuting the giants. The giants were part of their world.
Thank you, Dr. Elst. Now, the next question, Dr. Elst, is did the Hindus ever have any practice or doctrine of idol destruction?
Well, there are cases where Hindus take over Buddhist places, like the Mahabodhi temple that we just discussed, when the temple had fallen empty and there were no Buddhists to do Buddhist services in there. Well, then the place was adapted and then continued as a sacred place, but not a Buddhist place anymore. The reverse also happened, like what's it called in Cambodia, the Angkor Wat, which was a Vaishnava temple and was turned into a Buddhist temple. So this sometimes happened, though of course much less than what is claimed nowadays. There are people who say, oh yeah, the Brahmins turned stupas into temples. You see, that can only be said by people who've never been to a temple or never seen a stupa. The stupa is a totally different thing from a temple. It's not some building that you walk into. It's stupa is in fact an artificial hill. You see, hills were often used in the dim and distant past as grave hills, and so a corpse, or at least the remains of a corpse, a relic, like the tooth of the Buddha or so, is kept inside of there. That's a totally different thing from a temple. But yeah, here and there this may have happened. Like nowadays, I hear that they're saying this about the Jagannath temple in Puri. They should get their story straight, because I remember in the time of the Ayodhya controversy, of course, the secularists were at the exact same game as today. So they were saying, yeah, but Hindus have also done this. And look, you see in Puri, they have taken an animist shrine from the tribals. Now, I don't think that the tribals build shrines. I think they worship in the open air, just like the Vedic rishis. But anyway, for what it is worth, yes, there is a tribal presence at the site. And tribals, the local tribals, have a ritual role in the functioning of the Jagannath temple. But so that's a different lineage from the Buddhist one. And so you see, this story is a bit garbled. But on the whole, you see, in principle, I accept that this has happened here and there. That you see, a place that was no longer functionally Buddhist was continued as a sacred place, but with a different focus than the Buddha. What was your question again?
Dr. Els, the question was that did the Hindus ever have a practice or doctrine of
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that has to do with another story that you hear a lot these days. It was started by an American Marxist historian, Richard Eaton. And I don't throw the label Marxist around. That's only for people who themselves appropriate that label. He has called himself a Marxist. Okay? So he first of all minimizes what Muslims did to Hindus, though less than what people think. Like only yesterday I saw another YouTube video where some Muslim student in Cambridge was being interviewed by an Anglican theologian. And so he could give the whole story about how the Hindus are persecuting the Muslims, how the Hindus are doing false history and all that. And so he, of course, brought in the position of Richard Eaton. And so he said, yeah, and Richard Eaton has done a count, and there's in fact only 80 temples that the Muslims destroyed. That is not true at all, even according to Eaton's count. Of course, Eaton is a very much a negationist. He totally minimizes the magnitude of what Islamic rulers have done in India, but nevertheless not that bad as is being said here, because if you count these 80 cases of temple destruction, they don't mean 80 temples destroyed. Like one of the cases he enumerates is the destruction of 1,000 temples in Varanasi. So that's not one of the 80, that's 1,000. So the 80 are rather more than 80, are thousands themselves. So even according to Eaton, the Hindu temples, you see at least thousands among them were destroyed. Okay. Now, the point we're coming to is that this same Eaton has also said, oh, but it is an old Hindu habit. And so the Islamic invaders brought nothing new, they continued what was there. Well, first of all, of course, that royally overestimates the degree to which Islamic invaders took inspiration from Hindu example. In fact, mostly when they invaded here coming from Uzbekistan or so, they didn't know anything about the Hindu customs. And anyway, they didn't need those to guide them. You see, if they wanted to destroy temples, they had the example of the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad took over the Kaaba from the Arab pagans. The Arab pagans worshipped there. There were 360 idols in there, so that if people came on pilgrimage, because of course the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage, was also taken over from the pagans of Arabia. So when people from all over Arabia came there, they could always find a statue of the god that they particularly cherished. So they were all destroyed by Muhammad. This is described in Islamic sources. This is one of the great moments in Islam, when his enemy, Arab paganism, gets destroyed. Because the idea for him was not just to destroy statues, to destroy pieces of art. No, the idea for him was to destroy a religion of which those pieces of art were a representation. So you see, the Islamic invaders, whenever they care to justify what they were doing, they never, ever, ever refer to some Hindu example. They always refer to Muslim examples and ultimately to the example of the Prophet himself. Moreover, and it's another aspect to this, what did the Hindus do? You see, what does Eaton refer to when he says, okay, it's Hindus, that they take an example from? So they did not take an example from them, but nevertheless, there is something in Hindu tradition that could be brought to bear on this question. Namely, there was a habit among pagans in general, not just Hindus. You find many examples in Mesopotamia of abduction of idols. Like, for example, when the Assyrians in about 700 BC conquered Babylon, they took the main idol of the city god Marduk with them. Then 2 generations later, when the brother of Crown Prince Assurbanipal became the governor of Babylon, he, to make it a festive occasion, his own entry into the city where he would take up his new function, he brought back the statue of Marduk. And so everybody was overjoyed. And moreover, I will add to the belief, or some will say the superstition, that this idol had real power, because once the idol was back in Babylon, this new governor actually started a separatist movement. You see, he rebelled and tried to get the independence of Babylon. So clearly the god had instilled some pride in its people. I don't know. At any rate, the idol still existed. And so that was the general rule. You see, pagans had respect for other gods. You see, the god of another tribe was maybe not my god, but he had some power that you had better respect. So you can see, for instance, when Alexander the Great conquers this whole empire, he takes care to go and sacrifice to the main gods of all the areas he conquers. When he has conquered Egypt, he hears about some sacred place that the Egyptians themselves go on pilgrimage to. It's somewhere far in the desert in Libya. And so he takes time off from his busy schedule as a conqueror to actually go there and sacrifice to the gods. So this psychology determines what then happens with those statues, those idols. So yes, there are cases in Hindu history, not too many, but yes, there are, where a god is abducted. Now, what happens when a god or a god statue, an idol, is abducted? You see, in the place of the loser, okay, the venerated statue disappears, is taken away. So what happens? Well, the priest, who serves that statue, installs a new statue. It's in fact good for employment because some sculptor can make a new idol, and so that is consecrated, that's put in place. And the whole cult of that divinity simply continues. What happens at the winner's place? Okay, he brings in triumph the idol that he has abducted. What does he do? He goes to his own main temple, he installs that statue, and the worship of that statue continues. So this is a totally different thing from what happens in Islam, where Mahmud Ghaznavi takes the idols of the Somnath temple, takes them home, breaks them to pieces, and has them masoned into the lavatory or the steps of the mosques or so that all the faithful have the immense pleasure of trampling the idols underfoot. You see, what Ghaznavi and other idol breakers try to do is to destroy the religion. The cult is not continued, not in the place of the loser, certainly not in the place of the winner. There is no case at all of Ghaznavi or Aurangzeb or Ghori or Bakhtiyar Khilji taking a statue from the loser and installing it in his own mosque. You see, then it would be the same thing. Then Eton would have a point. If he can point to a case where you see some Islamic conqueror takes the statue of Shiva and puts Shiva central in his mosque for worship. But I don't think that has ever happened. So you see, that's a totally different thing. There is, of course, no Hindu doctrine of idol breaking, not even a doctrine of idol abduction, but the fact of idol abduction once in a while, very sparsely, is real. Yes.
So why this renewed interest in allegations of Hindus destroying temples now, Dr. Est?
Well, anything, of course, that blackens the Hindus is always welcome to the secularists. But you see, today, of course, the question of destroyed temples is in the news again. It was in the news during the Ayodhya movement. Back then, we also heard all these stories about Hindus having done it to Buddhists. So this is back now. Now that things are happening around the Kashi Vishwanath, where they discovered this Shiva Lingam, moreover, and Mathura. You see, those places are not historically contentious in the way that the Babri Masjid Ram Janmabhoomi was. You see, there was a claim that there had never been a temple there. Of course, that claim was false. That was easy to refute. There was plenty of evidence that, of course, there had been a temple there. But at least, you see, the eminent historians made an attempt, and then because of their position of authority, most of the media and so on fell in line, followed them, even all the Western Indologists who should have known better, just toed the line. But you see, in the case of Mathura, there is absolutely no reason to doubt this is the birthplace. Of course, there was a temple there. There are a number of descriptions of the successive destructions of this temple by Ghaznavi, by Aurangzeb. They themselves, of course, made no secret of it. In the case of Ayodhya, in the diary of Babar, the time that he spent in Ayodhya is not mentioned, not because he doesn't mention it, but because the pages containing this report have been carried away in some windstorm. He describes it in a later part of his diary. So there we don't have his own testimony. But in the case of Ghaznavi and Aurangzeb, we have it from the horse's mouth. And moreover, in the case of Kashi, the parts of the temple are still part of the mosque. You know, so I mean, there's absolutely no case in denying. Yes, of course, these Hindu temples were destroyed by Islamic iconoclasm. Now that, you see, they can't do anything about anymore. In the case of Ayodhya, they still made an attempt to deny the history. Here, it just doesn't work anymore. So they changed the focus and they try to say, oh yeah, but Hindus have also done this. And so therefore you have these stories. It can go quite far on social media, where you have, let's say, fanatics, Ambedkarites especially, who just anything that helps against Hindus they will use. So they will say that Buddhism was destroyed in India, not just these specific universities and so on, but you see, Buddhists as a whole have been wiped from India by Brahminical onslaughts, as the set phrase goes. But so that is now poked up, let's say, by the current news about these places of worship. Also, the Places of Worship Act. You see, now there is talk about abolishing that. Places of Worship Act from 1991 stipulated that all places of worship are frozen as they were in 1947, except for Ayodhya, which is allowed to be in dispute. And so now some neo-Buddhists are saying, but if that law goes away, if Hindus all over can claim the mosques built on their temples, then we too can do the same thing. So you see, that's not what the secularists have started this discourse about Hindus killing Buddhists for. But nevertheless, it has as a side effect that some neo-Buddhists, who are of course secularists in the operative sense that they hate Hinduism, they also may try this. And so from the secularist viewpoint, this is okay because it just, troubles Hindus. It can create problems for them, and that's what they want. So no, in a way, you should see the good side. The fact that they are desperately trying to accuse Hindus also means that Hindus have made a little progress. The history of temple destruction can't be denied anymore. That at least they have achieved.
I have a question. When there is sectarian conflict, if people are alleging Buddhist, Hindu sectarian conflict on a systematic basis, don't you think there should be aggression on the other side too? And if so, what is the evidence for Buddhist aggression on Hindus in India and outside India?
Well, not much. You see, the Buddhists in their monasteries were in no mood for aggression. The main case of Buddhist aggression in Indian history is by Ashoka, who was not a nice man to know. Otherwise, hardly any case in the case of India, at any rate. You see, nowadays with the Rohingyas in Myanmar, Time magazine has put on its cover one of the Buddhist leaders there, the face of Buddhist terror. And so now this idea has gained ground. But in Indian history, at any rate, you don't see that. There are also only few Buddhist rulers In fact, you see, the idea of the Buddhist ruler is also problematic. By Buddhist, normally you mean a Buddhist monk. There were also Buddhist lay followers, but you see, that was a very minor phenomenon, especially when you compare with a similar case of Jainism, where you have a real Jain community, a Jain lay community that supports from the monks recruited from its own circle. In the case of Buddhism, this is much less the case, and you see everywhere where Buddhism goes, in China, Japan, and so on, you can't say that the population becomes Buddhist. The population remains what it was. It remains Taoist and Shinto and so on. And then from among the population, Buddhist monks are recruited. And then, yes, through the education system and so on, they will also have an influence on the local culture. But in the main, you see, the local culture doesn't disappear. For instance, once I saw in Los Angeles, there's a Thai temple there. And there's quite a community of people immigrated from Thailand. And so they went there, to the Buddhist temple. So there's a big Buddha statue there, and they sacrifice to the statue. What do? They bring white chickens. The white is deemed some sacred color. They bring white chickens, and in front of the Buddha, they slash the head of the chicken. So the Buddha himself, as we know from the Pali Canon, was against animal sacrifice, which was still far more common in Brahminical circles in those days than it is today. But you see, this is traditional in their culture, sacrificing white chicken, and so that has been integrated into what much Buddhism they have there. What you have in all these so-called Buddhist countries is a lay community that just continues the ancient local religion, then more Buddhism-minded lay people whose life has been more transformed, more affected by Buddhism, who, for instance, will leave out those animal sacrifices. And then you have the actual Buddhist monks. The distinction is not very absolute, because many people in their young days become Buddhist monks for a few years. Indeed, you see, when you hear in the news about Buddhist monks have done this and that, it often means what you in a Western country would simply call students. So you see, people become monks, take vows for a few years, learn Buddhist sciences, often along with worldly sciences, and then step back into lay life. So you have this gradation of full Buddhists and half Buddhists and non-Buddhists, and that's the normal thing in a so-called Buddhist society, and Buddhists have never had any problem with it. It's not like in the Israelite religion, where a hardcore of full monotheists try to make the whole population monotheist, try to weed out all the remnants of idolatry that they found. You see, in the case of Buddhism, if there are many people who are not really Buddhist, well, that's their choice. You see, Buddhism is concerned with the Buddhist himself, not with the rest of society. And so, I mean, in the case of Indian history, I see hardly any case of aggression from Buddhists, just as I see hardly any case of aggression against Buddhists.
Namaste, Dr. S. As always, a very good talk and some interesting points that you mentioned. I just want to know your views on the fact that it's almost always like, something told to us, this, what I'm going to say, that this Brahminical appropriation of the Buddha as an avatar is actually what sort of then led to this huge movement of Buddhists, because a large population had converted to Buddhism back then. And that led to this sort of gradual, okay, this is like just one of us. We'll just, get on with how we were. And then you go back to whatever, primarily because Buddhism has a very strong monastic element, which is not quite in keeping with a normal Hindu's life of, the brahmacharya, the grihastashram, which is a cycle. So there's a sort of a conflict. So would it be fair to say that was a Brahminical appropriation, or you feel that just happened? I mean, avatar is an avatar.
Okay. I have to stop you because these are already a number of questions. I'll try to answer them all. First of all, you use the word conversion. That I don't agree with at all. Conversion is a Christian concept, later also adapted by Islam, where it means that you adopt one religion and you totally break with your earlier religion, like with King Clovis of what is now France, Belgium, who in 1496 converted to Christianity, and his baptism father told him, now burn what you worship. So, there's no halfway station. Whereas among Buddhists and Buddhists in China or Japan, or even among the neo-Buddhists who have a strong anti-Hindu animus, nevertheless, many of them still worship Hindu gods alongside the Buddha, alongside the picture of Dr. Ambedkar on their house altar. But so they don't make a clean break with Hinduism. Most of them don't. And so in the past also, there is just no sign of this, that they had to somehow abjure Shiva or Ganesha or whoever. Okay, then. And when you say the population in large numbers converted to Buddhism, I doubt whether it was in really very large numbers. You see, Buddhism was always an elite religion. You see, some people in the Dalit movement think that it was a Dalit movement. Not at all. It was absolutely an elite movement. And so that percentage of the population can't have been that large. Okay, now, no matter how large, and Buddhism actually could grow precisely because it was an elite movement. Very important to understand. You see, the Buddha himself, of course, was absolutely upper class, and so he knew personally all these magnates, all these princes in Kosala, in Magadha, in the Virgin Republic, and so on. So he profited from that in a very practical sense. You see, all these kings, they patronized all his monasteries. By the time he died, he had a network of monasteries spanning maybe half of India. And, if ever a youngster felt a calling to become a monk, well, the monastery was just around the corner. He could go there. And quantity breeds quality. So if you attract many of these young men, some of them are going to be bright. That's why you have a nice, pleasing Buddhist philosophy. Whereas rival sects like the Ajivikas and so on, they have gone into oblivion. Buddhism has become great. Even if you're not a believing Buddhist, Buddhist philosophy is a very important topic. And okay, so you see, Buddhism was absolutely an elite movement. Okay, now, what was your point again? Apart from what I already dealt with? Because I'm forgetting something.
Yes, my question, sir, was the Brahminical, this is
Oh,
what
yeah,
we've been talking.
avatar.
Appropriation as an avatar. So
Of course. Okay. Now, one thing you must always understand is in history, you have the onward march of time, and you get all kinds of evolutions. Like, for example, about caste, people quote Dharma Kirti, fulminating against caste, but that was 1200 years after the Buddha himself. Caste was not much of an issue in the time of the Buddha. And so the attitude towards caste evolves just as caste itself evolves as an institution. So here, in the case of Avatarvad, there was no Avatarvad at the time of the Buddha. You see, Rama and Krishna were, let's say, promoted to the status of avatar only gradually, only after their story had been written down. Like in the Ramayana, you see Rama turned into an avatar of Vishnu only in the introduction, and then in the added last chapter, Uttarakhand. And so initially in the story, that's not there at all. Rama is a human hero. And of course, he was human. He has a place in the genealogy of the solar dynasty. And the same thing with Krishna. You see, he's part of this Yadava tribe and so on. He's a human person with a mother and a father and a sister and a wife or many wives and so on. Just a human history, which ends all too human. You see, with this massacre in his family and he himself being shot to death by mistake. It's all very human. And it's only later writers who take the story becomes ever more prestigious, more embellished, more elaborate, and so it gets elevated higher and higher, and then this man becomes an avatar of Vishnu. Now, what does that mean, being an avatar of Vishnu? It means that your role in history has been somewhat the same as that of Vishnu within the pantheon, within Hindu mythology. Namely, Brahma is the creator, Shiva is the destroyer, and Vishnu is the maintainer, you see? And so Krishna, it is said, or Rama, it is said that they maintain the Dharma. They restore the Dharma when it is falling apart. So they make sure that the Dharma continues. Now, if you say that the Buddha is an avatar of Vishnu, that means the same thing. So the Buddha upholds the Dharma. That's all that, being an avatar of Vishnu means. Now, unfortunately, many of these devotional Hindus have made some kind of cartoon out of this, with a god up there and a status halfway of avatar, and then an ordinary status for us human beings. No, you see, Rama and Krishna and the Buddha were ordinary human beings. Like, this is a point I often make about the Buddha. Contrary to all the hagiography about him, not only 2,000 years ago, but even today, you see very many people. You can check Quora, for example, on that, and other social media. Very many neo-Buddhists, also Western Buddhists, they have this idea of the Buddha as infallible, as perfect. Now, if you study his life, he was not so perfect. He was a very good man. He was a bright man and so on, but he was not perfect. You see, he made some mistakes. He was, involved in political intrigues which he couldn't control, where things happened that better not have happened. Or, for instance, his body was not perfect. Now, later in life, often he gave his discourses while lying down because he had a backache, he couldn't sit anymore, and so on. So that's like very ordinary. Many old people get ailments, yes, and so the Buddha also. So that was not divine about him, but you could still call him an avatar of Vishnu in the sense that he played the role of maintaining the Dharma. Let me also note that his status of avatar is something that he brought upon himself. You see, this is not some Brahminical conspiracy to rope in Buddhism. No, you see, this he started himself. He was part of the solar dynasty. In fact, any Kshatriya from North India will say that he's part of the solar dynasty, or at least from the Ganga basin. So he was too. And this means he was a relative of Rama, not of Krishna, who is part of the lunar dynasty. Although if you go back far enough, they are also related. because the ancestress of the lunar dynasty was the sister of the ancestor of the solar dynasty. But I mean, at any rate, with Rama, that's a bit more close. And so he himself claimed to be not only a relative of Rama, but also the reincarnation of Rama. That's in the Jatakas. Of course, that's a literature centuries younger than the Buddha himself. But all writings we have in Buddhism are at least 300 years younger than the Buddha himself. So, I mean, if the intervening time is a problem, then you have no Buddhist texts at all. Okay? But so, according to a Buddhist text, again, this is not some Brahminical conspiracy. According to a Buddhist text itself, he himself claimed to be a reincarnation of Rama. Now, therefore, the day that Rama was elevated to incarnation of Vishnu, then his reincarnation of the Buddha automatically also becomes an incarnation of Vishnu. So, I mean, this is all fairly innocent. This is not a Brahminical conspiracy. But I am aware, of course, that there are different interpretations of this. And so in the Puranas, there are several explanations. So one of them is quite negative, where they say, okay, the Buddha was sent to the Asuras in order to mislead them, in order to give them the true path to enlightenment. He misled them by leading them to nothingness. And so in that way, you see, he preserved the Dharma, namely by misleading the enemies of the Dharma. Okay? So that's a bit of a nasty afterthought. Okay, so that also exists. But you see, within the Brahminical, mental world, you have all kinds of things. And so you have a lot of genuine feeling for the Buddha. Like in today's India, certainly, and you have people who call their children Rahula or Siddhartha or so, and in Amar Chitra Katha and other, sources, you see how respect for the Buddha is very much integrated into the religious feeling of most Hindus. But yes, the other side is also there. That's what you get in Hinduism. You can say black, and then you can also say white. They're both true.
A drama called Tughlaq by Girish Karnad, which is about Muhammad bin Tughlaq, in which a Muslim character says to another Muslim character, stay away from, because see, the Buddha being an avatar of Vishnu is inclusion of another community into ours. In Tughlaq, he very clearly says, stay away from the Hindus. A Hindu will come and embrace you, and he'll declare Muhammad to be an avatar and Islam to be another caste of Hinduism.
Okay, well, let me first say that some Muslims have done exactly the same thing. I think it is the Ismailite Muslims in Gujarat who claim that Krishna was a prophet on the same footing as Abraham and Moses and so on. So Krishna was also a prophet. In fact, this is a story that was created at the time when a number of Krishna worshippers converted to Islam. And so, you see, to give them some continuity, to make the conversion more palatable, they sort of integrated the belief in Krishna into their Islamic belief. And it's not entirely against Islam to do that. You see, as long as religious figures predate Muhammad, it's tolerable to integrate them. So to say that Krishna was also a prophet and Zoroaster was a prophet, and even the Buddha could be termed a prophet in that sense. It's only if it's after Muhammad, then of course it's against the idea that Muhammad is the seal of the prophet if you invent new prophets. Now, in the case of the Buddha, of course, there's a bit of a problem, namely that, maybe others call him an avatar of Vishnu, but in his own teachings, there is a strong element of atheism. Now, that's not entirely true. There are, in fact, texts, you see, that, of course, are kept absolutely under wraps by the Neo-Buddhists, where the Buddha praises the Devas and calls on people to worship the Devas. But on the whole, you see, in his system of meditation, the Devas play no role. So, if you're an unbeliever, you can practice the Buddhist system up to the end. You never ever encounter the Devas. Which you could say about the Yoga Sutra as well. The injunction to use Om as a mantra need not be interpreted as calling on the gods, calling on Shiva, though most Hindus make that of it. But in Buddhism, at any rate, there's no doubt about it at all. And so once more, I recall that in 2005, the Buddhist clergy in Cambodia protested against plans to enter into the textbooks the notion that religion is all about worshipping God. This, they said, is insinuated by the Christian missionaries. They want to give the idea that, religion means worshipping God. Well, we are a religion, we don't worship God. Okay? So, the idea of atheism within Buddhism is very real. And so to make him into a prophet of Allah, that is, and so that perhaps explains why that helps explain why there is this ire, this angriness of Muslims against Buddhism. And you see why Buddhism has so completely been destroyed wherever Islam went. So then, of course, there is the other element, and this is where Buddhism becomes a religion, but it's not good again, even in this avatar, if I may use the word, even in that form, because there you see very common people worship the Buddha. And so they don't worship somebody up there, no, they worship a historical character, the Buddha, just as many bhakts do with Rama or Krishna. And so they make idols. And so the Buddha statue is the idol par excellence. And indeed, you see the word Buddha became Persian Bud, which means idol. And so Bud Parasti is idol worship. Bud Shikani is idol breaking, iconoclasm. So there again, you see, Buddhism does not qualify for acceptance by Islam.
So to get back to the original idea of Hindus destroying Buddhist shrines, I thought you might want to comment on the questionnaire that Sitaram Goel actually presented to the eminent historians against such claims, and what its implications are in the current debate, current resurrected debate, in fact.
Yes. There is a claim by some eminent historians that the blood flowed, rivers of blood, you see, in the Buddhist monasteries under Brahminical onslaught. And so Goelji said, well, of course there have been debates, just there have been debates between all kinds of Hindu sects. But this case of bloody massacres of Buddhists, there is just no example in history. There's no record in history of that. And so he challenges them. I'm asking for an example of this. I'm not asking for two, just one. Do you have one example of this? Now, so far, me too, I have not encountered such an example. So that challenge is still open. And even if it is answered, you see, somebody may have lost his temper and committed a massacre, but that still doesn't mean that Hinduism has it in for Buddhism and that it's going to destroy Buddhism if it gets a chance. That, the massacre of Buddhists is somewhere on its program, and that if it gets the means to do that, it will come out in its true colors and massacre the Buddhists. That's just not the case. And indeed, Buddhism has flourished for so long in India. And you see, the quarrels among historians are about the so-called mistreatment of Buddhism, in the sense that patronage for Buddhist projects fell away, that kings channeled their funds to other statues, other temples than Buddhist ones, which draws attention to the fact that originally Buddhism enjoyed an enormous patronage. And so in the time of the Buddha himself, you see, Buddhism could grow and flourish thanks to this enormous patronage. Of course, the attraction to the figure of the Buddha and his very pleasing, very satisfactory teachings, that played a role, no doubt. But to say, as many devout Buddhists would, Buddhism was so successful because it was the best. Well, that's not the whole story. You see, Buddhism was also the wealthiest. It was being endowed with all kinds of patronage. Like, for example, many kings levied taxes, which came in the form of money for traders and so on. But for ordinary people, for craftsmen and so on, it came in the form of services. And so for a month in the year or so, they had to work for the king. And so in this case, the king, earned his punya, his religious merit, by ordering these workmen, okay, now you build a monastery for the Buddha. And so, you see, the Buddhism really, 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 and this is just insufficiently realized, profited enormously and became the leading sect thanks to this patronage that, the others couldn't hope to get. So when that fell away, or when that became less, well, that must have felt unpleasant to Buddhists, but that's something totally different from persecution. This question of patronage is also overrated, in the sense that historians speculate, for example, about something important in the history of Buddhism, namely the adoption of Sanskrit instead of Pali, as a ploy to get more patronage again. So they say, oh yeah, in order to negotiate at the courts, to get patronage, when the courts changed over from the popular language to Sanskrit, they also had to use Sanskrit. That's not at all an explanation for why Buddhist scripture changed over to Sanskrit. If it was only court negotiations for patronage, they could have selected one particularly proficient scholar and send him to court and do the negotiations in Sanskrit. For that, they didn't have to change their own system of functioning. No, you see, they changed over to Sanskrit because that was more practical. They could, use Sanskrit everywhere. And maybe somebody local had to then translate it into the local vernacular, but at any rate, they could take it everywhere. They could also take it not only today, but also 3 centuries from now, because it was a dead language, which doesn't mean it's not used, which means simply that it doesn't change anymore. Everybody learned Sanskrit from Panini 2,000 years ago and even today. So, you see, Sanskrit was a stable language and a universal language. That's why the Buddhist order adopted it, not because of negotiations at court for patronage. So you see, this issue of patronage is quite overrated, but yes, it may have played a certain role in the sense that Buddhism had less patronage later. And so you see fluctuations in the attendance in Buddhist monasteries. But you see, that's normal. That's in all the other sects also the case. And it doesn't annul the basic fact that Buddhism flourished for 17 centuries on end in India. That the universities that Bhakti Khilji destroyed were still in existence, still had thousands of students, mostly Buddhists. So you really can't blame Hinduism. And so the question that the challenge that Sitaram Goel asked of the eminent historians is still valid. You see, if you want to plead that Brahminical jihad destroyed Buddhism, okay, what is the evidence?
Dr. S, this is so revealing because I grew up hearing that Buddhism, and then for a couple of years, I followed one cult, you may say, in Buddhism, in which we were taught that Lotus Sutra has a line which says that Buddhism will originate in the land of the lotus, which is India, and migrate to the land of the sun, which is Japan, and later in the latter ages, it will come back from the land of the sun and to the land of the lotus where it has been destroyed. It will be so not only Buddhism, but even as a Hindu, I grew up with the idea that okay, Shankaracharya and his followers, they destroyed the mathas and that's how Buddhism got destroyed. So this is the first time I'm hearing this.
Yeah, well, Shankaracharya did not destroy any mathas. He is said to have debated Buddhists, though I haven't seen any account of that. I wouldn't be able to give the name of any Buddhist who was defeated in debate by Shankaracharya. You see, all this debate with Mandana Mishra and so on, we have records, but this about Buddhism is quite vague. But you see, if there had been actual destruction of Buddhist monasteries and so on, that we would have heard about. So that's just a story. Now the problem here is that most people know about Buddhism only through these modern introductory works. And so you have this modern myth about Buddhism being a rebellion against Brahmanism and against the Vedas and so on. And so many people say, yeah, Buddhism was against Hinduism. No. Where is this in the Buddhist canon? He was against Hinduism. That's not said anywhere. But you see, that's what modern textbooks say. It starts in the 19th century with this Christian misunderstanding of Buddhism. So the first Orientalists back then already construed Buddhism in terms of Christian history. The Buddha was vis-a-vis the Brahmins, the way Luther was against the Pope, the way Jesus was against the Pharisees. And, from there on, it gains steam. You see, it becomes more adversarial, more conflictual, and so that then it becomes the picture to get in introductory works. Even the people who study Buddhism in primary sources, they have first gone through these introductory works. They often, unless they consciously make an effort to free themselves from it, they often see the Buddhist sources through the lenses that have been put on their noses by the modern Orientalists and their followers.
I mean, this is not a question, but this is regarding Adi Shankaracharya, whose name just came up. So this is just a comment. So the traditional account, which is the Shankara Digvijaya, it does not mention that Shankaracharya directly debated Buddhists, but it does mention that his adversary, Kumarila Bhatta, who was a Mimamsaka, actually had in fact infiltrated Buddhist ranks and to understand their doctrines and then defeated them in debate. So in fact, the ground was already prepared by the Mimamsakas, if we may understand from this. And the poster to that story is that Kumarila Bhatta also felt sad about betraying his guru, and also about, he said that if the Vedas are true, then I will be saved, because they were trying to escape. And he felt guilty about saying that if the Vedas were true, because the Vedas are true. So he condemned himself to a very slow and agonizing death in paddy husk. That is a traditional account, in burning paddy husk.
Thank you.
So that is the traditional account. So it is very clear that this debate, if at all, is at a very elitist level. It is not percolating down into two groups of people picking up cudgels against each other. It is at a very elitist level where there are scholars involved, and they are still very careful about maintaining the proprieties of guru and shishya, and also belief in the Vedas and so on.
Yes, there is one story of a serious conflict that does involve war, but it's not with Hinduism, it's with Islam. You see, after Buddhism was destroyed in Sindh and West Punjab by the Arabs in the 8th century, the Buddhists reacted, and their reaction can be seen in a book called the Kala Chakra Tantra. The Kala Chakra means the wheel of time, means the zodiac, therefore also means astrology and means prediction of the future. And so this book is really a sort of variation on the Shiite doctrine of the Mahdi. You see, the Mahdi is a leader of the Muslims who will come at the end of time and who will fight the Antichrist. I mean, it's that Christian idea of the Antichrist. Here he is called Dajjal, the one-eyed one, who will lead an army of 70,000 Jews and some other categories. And so the Mahdi will defeat them. Now, that story was inverted with the idea that a Buddhist army is going to be formed at the end of times, and it is stipulated when this is going to be, and that will be victorious against the Mahdi. So the Mahdi is going to come, but he's going to be defeated. This confrontation is going to be in 2400 and I think 25, 24, thereabouts, 2400. And it's going to be led by the king of Shambhala, which is then situated in northern India, in Himachal or thereabouts. And he's called Rudra Chandra, and so he's going to be victorious. Now, this is 1800 years after the start of the Islamic calendar. So they're allowing Islam 1800 years of history, but then Islam will be defeated and destroyed, not necessarily by massacre. At any rate, Islam will disappear after the victory of Rudra Chandra, and then Buddhism will rule the world for 1800 years. Of course, this 1800 is a Hindu sacred number. And in fact, you see, the number of years is a bit complicated because the first years are real years, and then you get Islamic years, which are a bit shorter than real years. So the whole thing of 1800 years is not exactly 1800 real years. Anyway, that's a calculation I've done long ago. But at any rate, you see, that is the integration of the Islamic doctrine of conflict between Islam and all the rest into the Buddhist view of the future. And so this Rudra Chandra is often identified with the Maitreya, with the next Buddha, whom you find back in the Puranic doctrine of the 10th avatar, Kalki. Kalki is more or less mirrored on the Maitreya. Anyway, but so this is a Buddhist doctrine of sacred war, of holy war, projected into the future. And at the moment, the Dalai Lama regularly conducts ceremonies of initiation into the Kala Chakra. And so essentially what you promise there during that initiation, most people don't know in this funny Tibetan. But you know what they promise is that they're going to be soldiers in the army of Rudra Chandra in the incarnation that they have in 2400. Right? So that's a bit of a Buddhist doctrine of conflict. Nevertheless, it's modeled on Islam. So just like with Harsha of Kashmir, who behaved like a Turk, you know, here also this is inspired by Islam.